If you ever walk into a brand new ultra-modern skyscraper like one of those massive glass and steel monoliths in downtown Manhattan or, Tokyo, you don't really spend much time thinking about the foundation.
No, of course not. You're looking at the lobby.
Right. You walk through the revolving doors and your eyes are just immediately drawn upward. You're looking at the soaring atrium or the smart elevators that zip you to the 80th floor in like 2 seconds, the ambient lighting, the perfect climate control.
Yeah, you're completely captivated by the engineering that you can actually see.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You just assume the ground beneath it is doing its job. You assume the bedrock is solid.
We all do. I mean, we trust that the concrete was poured correctly deep underground decades ago. Nobody questions the dirt.
Right, the dirt.
Yeah, the subterranean pillar. Those are just, they're invisible givens.
But imagine if you are standing in that beautiful lobby, right, and suddenly the building starts swaying. And it's not swaying because the steel is weak. It's not swaying because a hurricane is blowing outside or, someone threw a rock. The structure itself is entirely flawless. It's swaying because the actual invisible ground underneath the building is quietly hollowing out.
That is a profoundly unsettling thought.
Right, because the prerequisite for the building standing at all is just vanishing beneath your feet.
Human beings, we really like our problems to be visible, to be engineered, to be things we can fix with a wrench or a software update.
Yeah, we want to fix the elevator shaft.
Exactly. We don't want to think about the tectonic plate shifting beneath the city. That's terrifying.
And that feeling, that deep structural vertigo, is exactly where we are taking you, the listener, today. So welcome to the deep dive. We are looking at a master's dissertation out of Oxford today, and it is a massive, dense, fascinating, and honestly, a pretty provocative piece of work.
It really is.
The title alone gives you a sense of the scale, right? The Ontological Architecture of Civilization.
Which tells you right away that this is not light reading.
Not at all.
The author is pulling from a massive variety of disciplines. I mean, we are crossing through theology, the philosophy of religion, historical anthropology, cognitive science.
Political philosophy, too.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. But underneath all of that academic weight, its core mission is uniquely incisive. It's actually very focused.
Let's set that mission right up front, just for you listening at home or on your commute. We are not here today to debate whether God exists.
Right.
We are not doing a theology show. We're not doing a debate on the origin of the universe. We are here to explore an incredible historical and sociological puzzle. And the core question is this: why does explicit philosophical atheism only appear very, very late in the history of every single civilization we know of?
It's a huge question, because if you dig into the documentary record across the globe, you find a really consistent pattern.
Yeah.
Atheism is never, in any culture, a founding principle.
Never.
Never. It is always a late arrival. And the author of this Oxford dissertation argues that this isn't just some, quirky historical fun fact or a coincidence.
Right. It's not just trivia.
No, they argue it's a diagnostic instrument.
Yeah.
The lateness of atheism actually reveals the invisible preconditions, the bedrock, like you said, that makes civilization possible in the first place.
And before we get into the ancient history of all that, I really want to plant a flag on why this matters to you right now as you listen to this.
Yeah, the real world stakes.
Exactly. Think about the secular modern institutions that you rely on every single day to live a safe and prosperous life. The court systems that uphold your contracts. The free markets that stock your grocery store.
The concept of universal human rights.
Yes. Democratic elections. The scientific method. The question this paper forces us to ask is, are those systems actually self-sustaining? Or are they running on the fumes of an older religious engine that we've completely forgotten how to refuel?
And to answer that, the author proposes a very specific causal chain. They explain how we got to where we are today, to a place where we even have those modern institutions.
Okay, let's unpack this. I'll try to map out this chain the author uses, and you just jump in and correct me if I stray.
Go for it.
So the sequence starts with reality, just the raw, given, mind-independent structure of what the universe actually is. And that reality shapes human nature.
Right.
It shapes our biological capacities, our psychological vulnerabilities, our intense need for meaning, our need for attachment to other human beings. But the author says human nature isn't enough on its own. It requires formation.
Yes. Formation is the crucial third link here.
What does that look like, practically?
Well, formation is the pre-rational habituation that happens to us.
Yeah.
It's the The daily rituals, the ancestral stories, the specific types of love and discipline that take a raw human infant and turn them into a person oriented toward a shared transcendent good.
Okay, so we have reality, which shapes human nature, which requires formation. And then formation, when sustained over many generations, is what actually builds civilization.
Exactly. It builds the cities and the shared cultures.
And then civilization creates institutions. These are the visible things, right? The legal codes, the universities, the bureaucracies.
Superstructure.
Right. And finally, those mature institutions operating over centuries eventually produce a specific psychological profile that the philosopher Charles Taylor calls a buffered self.
The buffered self. That is a fascinating concept.
Break that down for us a bit.
Sure. It basically describes a modern person who feels totally insulated from the ambient magic, the danger, and the transcendent meaning of the ancient world.
So they feel safe.
Totally safe. Their environment is so managed, so predictable, that they feel completely autonomous.
Okay, and the final link in the chain is this. Only once you have that buffered self, operating at scale in a highly institutionalized society, do you get explicit atheism as a stable, widely shared psychological option.
And that leads directly to modernity.
Right. But to understand why atheism comes dead last in that massive sequence, we actually have to hit rewind. We have to go back to the very beginning of human history, because there is a statistical reality about our species that just totally blew my mind when I was reading this source.
Oh, the timeline.
The timeline. We think civilization is normal. The truth is, civilization itself is an absolute freak occurrence.
We really do suffer from a severe case of recency bias.
Oh, big time.
Because everyone we know lives in a city or a town with roads and plumbing and laws. We just assume civilization is the default setting of humanity. But if we zoom out, like really zoom out and look at the actual time scale, anatomically modern humans have been walking the earth for roughly 300,000 years.
300,000 years. People who look just like us, who have the exact same hardware in their skulls.
Exactly the same brains. But civilization, and by that we mean densely populated settlements, agriculture, writing, centralized legal institutions.
Monumental architecture.
Yeah, that entire package only appears about 6,000 years ago, starting in places like Sumer in Mesopotamia.
I literally had to do the math on this when I read it because the scale is just so hard to grasp. If humans have been around for 300,000 years and civilization has only been around for 6,000, I mean, that means civilization occupies a mere 2% of human history.
Yeah.
2%.
Yeah, it's wild. For the preceding 98% of our existence as a species, we lived in small, nomadic, kin-based bands. There were no cities.
No writing.
No writing. There was absolutely no large-scale cooperation among genetically unrelated strangers.
I really want to pause and just let that sink in for you listening. The life you are living right now, the city you live in, the screen you are looking at right now, it is not our default state. It is a massive, glittering anomaly. It is a staggering achievement.
It really is.
So the natural question is, why is it so rare? Like, what kept us from building cities for 294,000 years?
To explain this, the author introduces a really brilliant conceptual tool. They call it the thermodynamic heuristic.
Okay, thermodynamic heuristic. Sounds intense.
Well, they're very careful to clarify that this isn't like literal physics, right? It's a sociological analogy based on the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, so entropy.
Exactly. In physics, any closed system naturally defaults toward entropy. It moves toward disorder, dispersion, and chaos. To maintain a highly ordered system, you need a continuous input of energy, a continuous application of what physicists call organizing work.
So it's like how my house naturally defaults to being a total disaster area unless I actively spend physical energy cleaning it up and putting things back in their place.
That is the perfect translation of the concept.
The mess is the default, right? The clean house is the achievement that requires constant work.
Yes. And in sociological terms, complex human cooperation is a highly ordered state. Getting thousands of genetically unrelated strangers to trust each other, to defer their immediate gratification, to tell the truth, to pay taxes.
To not kill each other.
Right, to not kill each other. That is an incredibly fragile, high-energy state. It defaults to decay and entropy. The literal moment, the formative work that sustains it, is withdrawn. Left to our own evolutionary devices, Our default setting is short-term self-interest.
And intense favoritism toward our immediate family members, probably.
Exactly.
Okay, I see where the author is going with this, but let me throw some friction into it, because the standard history class explanation that I got in school, it was purely material.
Right, the agricultural revolution.
Exactly. It basically said, look, humans were hunters. Then they invented agriculture. Suddenly they had a massive surplus of grain. And because they had extra food, they didn't have to move around anymore, so they built permanent houses. Boom, you get a city. The surplus food does the organizing. Why do we need all this talk about continuous organizing work against sociological entropy?
The author actually anticipates that exact materialist narrative. And they dismantle it by showing that agricultural surplus is necessary, yes, but it is deeply insufficient.
Insufficient how?
Because having a massive pile of extra grain in a silo does not magically alter human psychology.
That's fair.
It does not magically make unrelated strangers trust each other. It doesn't make a warlord decide to submit to a shared legal code instead of just taking the grain by force.
Honestly, if anything, having a giant silo full of extra food just means you have a giant target on your back. It gives your neighbors more reason to organize a raiding party and kill you.
And that is exactly what happened for millennia. So the author draws a crucial distinction here between knowledge and orientation.
Knowledge and orientation, okay.
Knowledge answers the question, what is this, or how do we do this? Early humans gained the knowledge of how to farm. But orientation answers the question, what is this for?
Ah, so a group of early humans can have the technical knowledge to build an irrigation ditch, right? And they harvest a surplus crop. But they need an orienting framework to decide that the grain should be distributed fairly to widows or, saved for a future famine.
Exactly. Or used to support specialized workers like builders and record keepers, rather than just hoarded by the strongest guy with the biggest club.
Right. And the historical reality is that the invisible glue providing that massive orientation, that continuous organizing work fighting against our default sociological entropy, was almost universally carried by religious and transcendent frameworks.
Universally.
And this isn't just philosophical speculation. The source takes us directly into the archaeological dirt to prove it. Because if surplus food isn't the magic ingredient that builds cities, we have to look at what early humans were actually doing when they laid those first bricks.
And doing so forces us to confront what the author calls the Enlightenment narrative. This is the story most of us inherited from 18th century thinkers.
Yeah, it's the whole religion is primitive science idea.
Exactly. The story goes like this. Early humans were terrified of the dark. They didn't have modern science, so they invented gods as a primitive coping mechanism. They needed an explanation for thunder, so they invented a thunder god.
So in this view, religion was basically just bad science. It was a cultural ornament, like a decorative trim on the building of early society.
But the author points out that the archaeological record completely shatters that narrative. When you actually dig up the earliest civilizational hearths, we're talking Sumer, ancient Egypt, Shang Dynasty China, Mesoamerica.
The big ones?
Yeah. In those places, religion isn't just a decorative gargoyle on the roof. It is the load-bearing structure of the entire society.
Load-bearing is the exact right term here. And the author doesn't just assert this metaphorically, right? They provide a strict three-part operational test to prove that religion was structurally load-bearing in the ancient world.
Yes. To meet this definition, a religious framework had to provide three things: economic centrality, juridical grounding, and temporal organization.
Okay, let's walk through these because this completely changed how I view ancient history. Economic centrality.
Yeah.
What did that actually look like in practice for, say, a Sumerian farmer?
Well, if we look at Uruk, or early Sumer, the cradle of civilization, the temple precinct wasn't just a quiet place you went to pray for a good harvest on the weekend.
Right.
The temple was the central bank. It was the primary granary. It was a centralized labor hub. And the most stunning piece of evidence for this is the invention of writing itself.
Oh, this part is amazing.
The earliest cuneiform tablets ever discovered by archaeologists are not sweeping mythological poems. They're not prayers. They're literally temple accounting spreadsheets.
That fact is just staggering to me. The single most important technological leap in human communication writing was invented just so priests could keep track of the cosmic budget. They were logging how many sheep and bushels of barley belonged to the domain of the local god.
Yes, because there was no secular bureaucracy for the temple to co-opt. The temple was the economy. The transcendent framework was the only mechanism powerful enough to compel thousands of people to pool their resources into a central location.
Okay, so the religion is literally running the banks. That brings us to the second criteria, juridical grounding. How does the law work?
This deals with legitimacy. In early civilizations, the laws were not based on the consent of the governed. They weren't debating social contract theory in the town square.
No Locke or Rousseau in ancient Babylon.
Definitely not. The laws were explicitly based on cosmic order. A classic, vivid example is the Stele of Hammurabi from Babylon.
This is the massive black stone pillar that has the famous eye for an eye legal code carved into it, right?
Yes, but the key to understanding it is the carving at the very top of the stone. It depicts King Hammurabi physically standing before Shamash, the sun god and the god of justice.
Oh, so he's receiving the laws.
Exactly. Shamash is literally handing the symbols of law to the king. So if a Babylonian peasant asks, why must I obey this law regarding property rights? The answer was never because the king is stronger than you.
Right.
The answer was because this is the transcendent divine order of the universe, and violating it brings cosmic ruin.
Man. And the third criterion is temporal organization, organizing time itself.
Yes. The priesthoods were the managers of the calendar. In Egypt, the pharaoh's entire legitimacy was tied to his ability to guarantee the divine cosmic harmony that ensured the Nile would flood on schedule and irrigate the crops.
So if the flood doesn't happen, the pharaoh is in trouble.
Big trouble. And in Mesoamerica, the Maya constructed their massive pyramids as giant calendrical instruments, tracking the movements of Venus and the sun. The economy was completely dependent on the agricultural cycle, and the agricultural cycle was managed liturgically.
So the very experience of a Tuesday versus a Friday was organized by the transcendent framework?
Exactly.
Okay, I hear all of this, and the historical facts are totally undeniable, but I have to put on my skeptic hat for a second. Let's look at this cynically. Couldn't all of this just be the greatest PR campaign in human history?
What do you mean?
Well, you have elite kings and powerful priests who want to hold on to their massive silos of grain and maintain their luxurious lifestyles, right? So they invent a cosmic justification. They tell the peasants that the sun god demands a 20% tax. Isn't it just a way to legitimize their raw power and keep the working class in line?
What you're describing is the classic Marxist functionalist critique. Sociologists call it the legitimation objection. The idea is that raw material power comes first, and then piety and religion are just a cloak draped over that power to make it cheaper to enforce.
It makes sense intuitively. I mean, it is vastly cheaper to convince a population that God wants you to pay your taxes than it is to hire a standing army of 1,000 guards to violently extract those taxes from every single farmer.
It does make intuitive sense until you look closer. The author of the dissertation completely dismantles this objection using a brilliant analogy, counterfeit currency.
Ooh, walk us through the counterfeit money idea.
Imagine someone printing a fake $100 bill. A counterfeit bill only works, it only has purchasing power, if the general population already deeply believes that a real $100 bill has value.
Right.
If you try to hand a fake $100 bill to a society that uses seashells for money, they will just laugh at you.
Oh, man. Wow.
A cynical, manipulative priesthood can only exploit a cosmic sanction if the population has already been deeply formed over generations to view cosmic order as binding and terrifyingly real.
So you cannot fake a religious mandate to a population of secular materialists. If a king stands up in front of a bunch of atheists and says, the sun god commands you to give me your sheep, the crowd doesn't bow down. They ask for a psychiatric evaluation.
Exactly the point. Draping your political power in transcendent religious language only cheapens your enforcement costs if that language already carries immense, unquestioned psychological and sociological weight.
That makes total sense.
The elites could not invent that formation out of thin air just to secure their power. They could only piggyback on a system of meaning that was already there. The legitimation theory, ironically, proves the author's point.
Yeah.
It assumes a populace that is deeply fundamentally wired for transcendence.
That is such a powerful flip of the argument. So, to summarize the chain so far, this deep, transcendent belief system is the engine. It provides the orientation that builds the first cities, organizes the massive agricultural surplus, and invents writing itself. It creates civilization.
Yes.
But the paper takes a wild turn here because in the process of building the city, the surplus, and the writing, religion ironically builds the very weapons that will eventually be used to dismantle it.
This is the central historical punchline of the dissertation, really. And it answers the core puzzle we established at the beginning of the deep dive.
Let's lay out the historical reality.
Systematic philosophical atheism is never a founding civilizational orientation.
Yeah.
It never builds the city. It always, without exception, appears late. It appears inside mature, highly literate civilizations, and it appears specifically among a leisured class of intellectuals.
We need to ground this in history. Show us the timeline. What does late mean?
Let's look at ancient Greece. Civilization in the Mediterranean basin is humming along for centuries, even millennia. You have the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the early Greek city-states, all deeply enmeshed in a world of gods, sacrifices, and divine fate.
Right.
It takes roughly 2,500 years of deep religious and civilizational development before you get figures like Epicurus, or later the Roman poet Lucretius.
And what are Epicurus and Lucretius saying?
They're articulating a truly naturalistic universe. They're looking at the world and saying, there are no gods managing this. There is no divine providence. The universe is just atoms and void crashing into each other.
But the crucial point is that 2,500-year runway.
Yes. And look at where this philosophy emerges. Epicurus establishes a school called the Garden. It is a private, walled community of friends who retreat from public life to discuss philosophy.
So they're not out tilling the fields.
Exactly. They are entirely supported by the agricultural and commercial surplus of a mature, functioning Greek civilization. They aren't worrying about fending off barbarian raids or starving in the winter. They are using an inherited vocabulary of debate, logic, and writing that took centuries of religious culture to build.
What about outside the Western tradition? Because a lot of people will immediately point to Eastern philosophies as being non-theistic or secular from the start.
The author tackles the Eastern counterexamples head-on, actually. The hardest test case for their theory is the Carvaka school in ancient India.
Oh, I've heard of them.
Yeah, it's a fascinating radical tradition of materialist and empiricist thought. The Carvaka philosophers explicitly denied the existence of the afterlife, they denied karma, and they openly mocked the gods. And this school is very old, significantly predating Greek atheism.
So doesn't the existence of ancient Indian atheism break the author's rule, if it's that old?
It doesn't break the rule at all, precisely because of where Carvaka sits in the historical sequence.
Yeah.
Carvaka did not found Indian civilization. It did not build the first cities along the Indus River. It arose strictly in opposition to a mature, highly entrenched Vedic religious order.
Oh, interesting.
Its entire philosophical doctrine is structured as a negation of Vedic authority.
It's a rebellion against the establishment.
It is entirely reactionary. In fact, there is an incredible historical irony here. The original texts of the Carvaka school have been completely lost to history.
Wait, really?
Yes. We only know what they believe today because their arguments were meticulously recorded inside the rebuttal texts written by their religious Vedic opponents.
That is amazing. The religious scholars thought the atheists made such good sparring partners that they preserved the atheist arguments just to show how to defeat them.
Exactly. And we see the exact same pattern in Han Dynasty China. You get the great skeptic and materialist Wang Chang. But he appears a full millennium after the intense bone oracle theocracy of the Shang dynasty had built the foundations of Chinese culture.
I feel like there's a distinction we need to make here, though. Surely ancient people had doubts. Like, surely some peasant in ancient Sumer, whose crops just failed and whose child got sick, looked up at the sky and thought, maybe the gods aren't listening, maybe this is all made up. Are we really saying nobody doubted until Epicurus?
This is a vital distinction the source makes, and it's essential for understanding human psychology. There is a massive difference between doubt and denial.
Okay, unpack that.
The ancient world is absolutely overflowing with doubt. The religious texts themselves are full of it. Look at the book of Job in the Hebrew Bible, or the book of Ecclesiastes. Look at the Babylonian lamentation hymns where sufferers literally scream at the heavens.
Why do bad things happen to good people? That is an ancient genre.
Yes. But when Job is sitting in the ashes, covered in boils, he is questioning divine justice within a transcendent framework. He is arguing with God. He is angry at the cosmic order.
Right.
But he's not saying, actually, the universe is just composed of indifferent atoms, and my suffering is just a mathematically random collision of molecules.
Right. It's the difference between feeling abandoned by your father versus concluding that the concept of fatherhood is a biological illusion.
That's a great way to put it. Explicit denial of the framework itself, saying there is no transcendent order at all, requires an astonishing accumulation of intellectual infrastructure. It requires a civilization that has produced enough surplus wealth to afford a leisured class. It requires a long tradition of written logic. It requires peace. Atheism, historically speaking, is a luxury good.
A luxury good. That brings up a massive philosophical question. The historical sequence is perfectly clear. Religion builds the civilization creates surplus and leisure, and that leisure creates the intellectual space for explicit atheism.
Yeah.
But why is it always that sequence? Why couldn't a group of rationalist atheists just get together at the dawn of time, agree on a set of secular human rights, and build a civilization from scratch? To answer that, the author moves from history to philosophy.
And this is where we dive into one of the most profound concepts in the dissertation, the idea of privatio boni, or Augustinian privation.
We need to define this carefully. What exactly is privation?
The concept originates heavily with Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century. He was wrestling with the problem of evil, and he concluded that evil, or absence, or corruption, is not a standalone substance.
Okay.
It isn't a rival first principle battling against the good. Evil is merely a corruption, a degradation, or a lack of a good that naturally ought to be there.
Give us an analogy to make this concrete.
Think of blindness. Blindness isn't a thing you can isolate and put in a jar. Blindness is simply the absence of sight in an organ that was designed to see. Or think of cold. Cold isn't a physical energy. Cold is just the absence of thermal heat.
The analogy that came to my mind was rust. If I'm an engineer trying to build a bridge, I can look at iron and say, I can build with this. But rust isn't a second type of metal that I can smelt and build a different kind of bridge out of. Rust is just the degradation of the iron.
That's perfect.
You can't have rust unless you have iron first. Or think of a hole in the ground. A hole isn't a substance, it's a lack of dirt. You can't dig a hole if there's no ground to begin with.
Those are perfect analogies.
Yeah.
And the author applies this exact structural logic to explicit atheism. They argue that atheism is logically and historically parasitic.
Parasitic, wow.
Yeah, it doesn't generate a novel ontological reality out of nothing. It negates an inherited religious reality. It unmakes.
It's the rust on the iron of civilization.
Yes. Look at the ancient philosophers we just discussed. Epicureanism is a point-by-point negation of Greek civic religion. The Carvaka school only makes sense as a direct negation of the Vedas. Atheism takes its shape, its debate topics, and its entire vocabulary from the grammar of the religion it is arguing against.
Like a mold.
Exactly. Just as a mold takes its shape completely from the object that is pressed into it. A mold is just empty space, defined by the solid object it used to hold.
I really want to pause the analysis right here and speak directly to you, the listener, because this is a highly sensitive point. I want to be incredibly clear about what the author is and isn't saying. This source is not making a moral judgment.
No, not at all.
It is not saying that atheists are bad people or that atheism leads to moral corruption. It is not even arguing that the conclusions of atheism about the universe are false. You can have incredibly moral, upright, self-sacrificing, beautiful people who are explicit atheists.
That is a vital clarification. This is a structural and historical argument, not a personal one.
The argument is simply this. Civilizationally speaking, atheism spends moral capital. It doesn't earn it. You can't rebel against a transcendent order that hasn't been built yet. You can't deconstruct a building that hasn't been framed.
And that means the secular order doesn't stand beside the religious order like a second independent skyscraper. It stands within the original skyscraper, hollowing it out, using the structural integrity of the original steel beams to keep the roof from collapsing while it slowly removes the walls.
That is a staggering philosophical claim. But philosophy tells us that atheism is structurally an unmaking. Do the hard sciences actually back that up? Does modern science show that human beings are fundamentally wired for the transcendent and that unbelief goes against our baseline nature?
This is where the dissertation takes a fascinating pivot, bringing in a completely different set of receipts.
I love this part.
The author looks at convergent evidence from modern naturalistic sciences. We're talking about fields like cognitive psychology and evolutionary biology disciplines that are methodologically indifferent to theology. They don't care if God exists. They just study how humans behave.
The source walks through 4 distinct scientific frameworks to prove this. Let's explore the first one. The cognitive science of religion.
Researchers in this field, prominently figures like Justin Barrett, argue that human minds possess a built-in cognitive mechanism called a hypersensitive agency detection device, or HADD.
Okay, HADD. Give us an example of how that works.
Think about an early hominid walking through the tall grass of the savanna. They hear a sudden rustle in the bushes. From an evolutionary survival standpoint, it is vastly safer to assume that the rustle is an agent, like a hungry tiger, rather than just the wind.
Right, because if you assume it's a tiger and it's actually just the wind, you waste a little adrenaline running away. No big deal.
Exactly.
But if you assume it's the wind and it's actually a tiger, well, you get eaten and you don't pass on your genes. Better safe than sorry.
And because of millions of years of this evolutionary pressure, human cognition naturally biases toward finding agency, intention, and mind behind events in the natural world.
We look for the who behind the what.
Exactly. We are also wired with a bias toward what psychologists call minimally counterintuitive concepts.
What does that mean, practically?
It means ideas that violate our normal physical expectations, just enough to be incredibly memorable, but not so much that they are incomprehensible.
Give me an example.
Like a tree that talks, or a being that can see everything without having physical eyes. These concepts stick to human memory, like glue.
So if you look purely at the cognitive software we are born with, belief in the supernatural or the transcendent is actually the species-typical default.
It is not an evolutionary glitch or a virus in the system. It is the baseline operating system.
Let's move to the second framework, which scales up from individual cognition to group behavior. Moral foundations theory. This is based on the famous work of the social psychologist Jonathan Haidt.
Haidt's research really revolutionized how we understand morality. He found that human morality across all cultures relies on a cluster of foundational intuitions.
Okay.
The issue is that modern, secular, rationalist ethics tend to focus almost exclusively on only two of these foundations: care and fairness.
Care and fairness. The secular goal is basically to prevent harm and ensure everyone is treated equally, which to modern ears sounds like the complete definition of a good society. Don't hurt people and be fair. What else is there?
It sounds complete to us, yes, but Haidt's data shows that for large groups of humans to actually cooperate, to fight off invaders, and to bind together across generations, they rely heavily on three other moral foundations: loyalty, authority, and sanctity.
Sanctity. That is a deeply religious, transcendent word.
And it is absolutely necessary for group cohesion. Purely rationalist, secular ethics systematically ignore or even devalue loyalty, authority, and sanctity. They view them as primitive.
Right.
But the sociological reality is that civilization requires those binding foundations to hold unrelated strangers together when times get hard. A society based only on care and fairness fragments when put under intense pressure.
That is profound. Okay, the third scientific framework looks at how we actually develop these capacities in individuals. Attachment theory, pioneered by John Bowlby. I know a bit about this from reading about early childhood psychology.
Bowlby's work is foundational to understanding human development. He showed through extensive observation that a child can only confidently explore the world, take risks, and develop a sense of autonomy if they first have a secure base.
A secure base.
This means they must have an unchosen, absolute dependence on a reliable caregiver, usually a mother or father.
I've totally seen this with my friends' toddlers. If the toddler knows mom is sitting right there on the couch, they will bravely walk all the way across the room to investigate a new toy. They look back, see mom, and keep exploring.
Yep.
But the moment mom leaves the room, the child freezes up, drops the toy, and starts crying. The autonomy completely collapses without the secure base.
The author of the dissertation takes Bowlby's psychological insight and applies it civilizationally.
Okay, how does that work?
Human intellectual autonomy, the ability to rigorously question traditions, to do skeptical philosophy, to become an explicit atheist, is only psychologically possible after a long period of unchosen dependence on a civilizational, secure base. The skeptical critics of inherited religion are exercising an intellectual capacity that the religious inheritance itself built and secured for them.
They can only walk across the room and analyze the toy because their religious secure base is sitting on the couch behind them.
Precisely. And the fourth and final scientific framework brings all of this together: distributed cognition.
Break down distributed cognition for us.
It's the realization that human knowledge and orientation don't just live inside individual skulls.
Where else would they live?
Knowledge lives in our shared rituals, our physical environments, our tools, and our social procedures. The classic example is navigating a massive naval ship.
Okay.
No single sailor, not even the captain, is doing all the complex trigonometric math in their head to get the ship across the ocean. The knowledge of navigation is distributed. It's in the design of the astrolabe, the layout of the compass, the standard operating procedures, the division of labor among the crew.
So, applying that to our topic, a culture's orientation, its deepest transcendent values, are encoded into its daily practices, its legal systems, its holidays. Even if the individual citizens walking around no longer explicitly believe the theology that originally created those practices.
The environment does the believing for them.
Yeah.
And we will definitely return to this concept because it perfectly explains how a highly secular modern society keeps running smoothly, even after the churches empty out.
I love how all these scientific disciplines converge on the exact same point. But I have to throw another piece of friction into the conversation here. Let's go back to the first framework, the cognitive science and the hypersensitive agency detection device.
HEDD, yes.
Usually when I hear pop science communicators talk about that concept, they use it to violently debunk religion.
All the time.
They say, see, God isn't real. Your belief in the divine is just a leftover evolutionary brain glitch from when we were dodging tigers in the savannah. Once we realize it's just a glitch, we can abandon religion.
The author knows that argument well, and they flip it on its head with devastating logic.
Walk us through the flip.
Let's completely concede the atheist debunker's premise. Let's agree that belief in transcendence is simply the cognitive default of our evolved biology.
Okay, assuming it is.
If that is true, then removing that belief is not a simple matter of waking up and being rational. Removing a biological default requires a massive, exhausting, historically unprecedented construction project. Unbelief must be built piece by piece against the very grain of human nature.
Oh, that is brilliant. So atheism isn't just a matter of taking off a blindfold and seeing the real world. Atheism requires actively building a highly engineered sensory deprivation tank so you don't feel the ambient signals of the universe anymore.
That is a phenomenal metaphor. It takes immense institutional scaffolding to maintain that sensory deprivation tank.
Which leads us directly to the next phase of the author's argument. If unbelief requires so much effort, what kind of psychological and institutional fortress did modern humans have to build to allow us to live comfortably without the transcendent?
This is where we return to Charles Taylor and his concept of the buffered self, which we mentioned briefly in the opening sequence.
We need to dive deep into this. Contrast the modern buffered self with how people used to live.
Taylor argues that pre-modern humans, for almost all of history, possessed a porous self. They felt intimately vulnerable to the outside world. The boundary between their inner mind and the outer cosmos was highly permeable.
Permeable how?
They were vulnerable to spiritual forces, to demons, to divine grace, to curses, to the ambient meaning of the physical world.
So if you are a peasant walking into a dark, ancient forest in the year 1200, that forest isn't just a collection of timber resources. It is alive with intent. It has a spiritual weight to it.
Exactly. But over the last 500 years, modern institutions systematically insulated us from that vulnerability. Think about what the simple invention of widespread electric light does to our primal fear of the dark and the unknown.
It totally neutralizes it.
Right. Think about what modern actuarial insurance does. You don't have to rely entirely on divine providence or village charity if your house burns down. You have a contractual safety net. Think about modern medicine, antibiotics, and central heating.
So our technology and our massive bureaucracies literally act as a buffer. They put a thick layer of institutional insulation between our fragile bodies and the raw chaos of the universe.
And in doing so, they created a new type of human psychology. The buffered self is an individual for whom disbelief is, for the first time in human history, a comfortable, psychologically livable option.
So it's not that they're smarter.
No. The buffered self isn't necessarily a person who rigorously read a bunch of philosophy and rationally reasons their way past religion. They are simply a person whose modern environment completely insulates them from the visceral need for it.
Before we go further, I want to call a quick timeout. The title of this dissertation is The Ontological Architecture of Civilization. We have been throwing the word ontological around a bit, and the author talks constantly about the ontological infrastructure beneath these modern buffers. For the listener who hasn't taken Philosophy 101, let's give a clear, explain like I'm at 5 definition of ontology.
It's a great catch, because the term is doing heavy lifting.
Put simply, ontology is the philosophical study of being.
Being.
Right. It's the study of what is fundamentally real, what actually exists at the deepest level, beyond just our opinions or social constructs.
So if I say something is an ontological reality, I'm saying it's woven into the very fabric of existence.
Yes. So when the author talks about the ontological infrastructure of civilization, they are talking about the deep, invisible, fundamental realities that hold a society together. The visible institutions are things you can touch or read, a paved highway, a dollar bill, a written constitution.
But beneath those visible things lies the ontological infrastructure. And the author identifies 9 specific, unlegislatable goods that make up this bedrock.
Let's list these 9 goods, because understanding them is the key to understanding why our modern systems might be swaying.
The author categorizes them into 3 groups. First, there are goods of shared intelligibility, truthfulness, conscience, and meaning.
Truthfulness, conscience, meaning.
Second, there are goods of generative continuity, family, sacrifice, and hope.
Family, sacrifice, hope.
And third, there are goods of the self-transcending bond, trust, duty, and transcendence.
I look at that list, truthfulness, conscience, trust, duty, sacrifice, and I think, well, of course a society needs those, but the author calls them unlegislatable goods. Why can't we just mandate them? If a society realizes it's running low on trust, why can't the government just pass a comprehensive National Trust Act and force everyone to be honest?
Because of the fundamental nature of law. The law can only operate on external behavior. It cannot operate on internal disposition. A law can force you to comply through the threat of violence or imprisonment, but it cannot force you to genuinely believe in the good of what you are doing.
Right.
And here is the truly terrifying mechanism the author reveals. The law actually consumes these ontological goods. It does not create them.
Wait, I need you to explain that mechanism. How does a law consume a good, like truthfulness?
Think about the functioning of a modern court system. A trial process runs on the fundamental assumption that the vast majority of citizens possess an internal disposition toward truthfulness.
Okay.
It assumes a witness will take the stand and tell the truth, even when they aren't being actively monitored, or even when telling the truth might be slightly socially disadvantageous to them. The court consumes that societal reservoir of truthfulness in order to reach a verdict.
Because if literally everyone in the society is lying all the time, if there is zero internal disposition toward truth, the court completely grinds to a halt. You can't prosecute someone for perjury if every single witness, lawyer, and investigator is perjuring themselves simultaneously.
Exactly. If no one is formed by a transcendent framework to be truthful internally, the only way a society can function is through universal panoptic surveillance. You have to put a camera on everyone at all times to force behavioral compliance.
Wow.
And a society that requires universal surveillance to prevent total collapse is not a healthy civilization. It is a civilization that is entirely bankrupt of its ontological infrastructure.
So you cannot legislate a conscience. You have to form it. And if this invisible infrastructure is the battery pack of civilization, we have to ask, what exactly is charging it? How does a society continually reduce people who have conscience, hope, and trust?
The author answers this by arguing that a civilization survives by transmitting its deepest orientation through three formative currents. They label these currents light, life, and love.
Light, life, and love. Let's break the mechanics of these down. And just to clarify, I know the author draws these terms from what they call Johannine grammar.
Yes, that refers to the Gospel of John in the Christian New Testament, which famously opens with, "In the beginning was the Word," and heavily features themes of divine light, life, and love.
Okay.
But the author strips the specific theology out of those terms to look at their raw, underlying anthropological function.
Okay, so looking at it anthropologically, what is the current of light?
Light is the deep conviction of truth and intelligibility. It is the pre-rational belief that reality is fundamentally knowable, that the universe makes sense, that it isn't just a chaotic trick, and that human reason is not a fraud. It's the conviction that truth exists and is worth pursuing.
That makes sense. What about life?
Life is the conviction of vitality and telos.
Telos meaning the ultimate goal or purpose of a thing.
Exactly. The current of life is the belief that human existence is dynamic, that we are growing toward a purposeful end, and that a human life isn't just a mathematically random sequence of biological events.
It's going somewhere.
Yes, it's the conviction that our existence is ordered toward flourishing. It is the raw, visceral energy that makes a human being care about the future and desire to have children.
And the third current, love.
Love is the conviction of the self-giving bond. It is the belief that the highest possible good for a human being requires surrendering your autonomy to something beyond yourself. It's the willingness to be bound to your kin, your community, your spouse, or to divine covenant.
Light, life, and love. So if these are the three currents that charge the battery of a civilization, what does this mean for us today? Because when I look around at modern secular culture, it feels like we have profoundly mutated these concepts.
Oh, we have. The author points out that modernity brackets these currents out of their transcendent origins. We naturalize them, we flatten them. The transcendent concept of light is reduced to mere empirical data and information.
Right. Truth is no longer an encounter with the divine order of the cosmos. Truth is just having access to a Wikipedia page with the correct statistics.
Exactly. And love undergoes a similar flattening. It is psychologized into subjective, fleeting, personal preference. It's no longer understood as a binding sacrificial covenant that demands your life. It's just how you happen to feel about a certain person at a given moment in time.
As long as it makes you happy, it's love.
Precisely.
And life.
Life is naturalized into mere biological, metabolic process. You aren't a soul growing toward a divine purpose. You are just a highly complex mammal metabolizing calories and avoiding pain until your heart inevitably stops.
It is incredibly bleak when you lay it out so starkly. But here is the most crucial and perhaps the most surprising insight from the source material. The author argues that modern secular institutions can actually fake two of these currents incredibly well. They have developed what the author calls institutional prostheses.
Yes, the modern university system, the scientific method, and mass media perfectly deliver light in its bracketed, flattened form as information. We're swimming in more data, more facts, and more knowledge than any generation in human history.
So light has a prosthesis. What about love?
The massive administrative state, the social welfare systems, the safety nets, the redistributive tax codes, these deliver procedural love. They administer care, fairness, and harm reduction with an efficiency that ancient kings couldn't even dream of.
Okay, so we have massive institutions generating fake light and fake love. But what about life?
This is the crux of the modern crisis. Life has no institutional prosthesis.
None at all.
None. There is no bureaucracy on earth that can force a citizen to deeply desire to bring a child into the world. There is no government agency that can make the painful process of growing up and taking on responsibility feel like a transcendent calling rather than an oppressive burden.
Wow.
No tax policy can artificially manufacture the pre-rational conviction that the future is inherently good and worth the incredible cost of peopling it.
Life must be deeply, viscerally felt as a personal conviction. And that insight sets up the ultimate test case for this entire dissertation. Because if life is the one current that has no institutional backup, it should logically be the first thing to break in highly secularized, wealthy societies.
And this brings us to the biggest, most common counterargument to the author's whole thesis.
I am so glad we are hitting this because as I was reading the paper, I kept thinking of this exact objection. I struggle with the author's premise because I look at my friends who live in places like Scandinavia, look at Sweden, Norway, Denmark, or look at Japan.
Right, a secular utopia.
Exactly. These are incredibly secular societies. Church attendance is near zero. Explicit atheism is the overwhelming norm. And yet they are peaceful, they are massively prosperous, they have incredibly low crime, and they have the highest social trust metrics on the planet. Doesn't the sheer existence of a happy, functioning atheist Sweden completely destroy this whole civilization needs religion argument?
The author faces that exact challenge directly, and they explain the phenomenon using a concept called inertial decay.
Inertial decay, like physics inertia. If I'm driving my car at 70 miles an hour and I take my foot completely off the gas pedal, the car doesn't instantly stop. It keeps rolling forward smoothly for quite a while just on its own momentum.
That is exactly the dynamic. The author argues that these highly successful secular societies are currently coasting. They are running on massive reserves of inherited moral capital.
Coasting?
This ties directly back to the concept of distributed cognition we discussed earlier. The social practices, the high-trust institutions, and the deeply formed ethical habits of the population outlast the explicit religious beliefs that originally forged them.
So a secular Swede today, who has never read the Bible, is operating on a baseline of social trust and civic duty that was hammered into the culture by centuries of intensely devout Lutheran ancestors. The infrastructure is still there, even if the theology is gone.
Yes, it is like structural fatigue in a piece of metal engineering. The surface of the metal looks shiny, solid, and completely perfect, right up until the exact microsecond it abruptly snaps. The ontological infrastructure decays slowly, generation by generation, invisibly.
Okay, I hear that argument, but a harsh critic could just respond, that's a convenient cop-out. You're just predicting a doomsday that hasn't happened yet. How do we actually know the infrastructure is decaying? Where is the proof?
That is exactly where the current of life comes in as the definitive diagnostic test, because life cannot be proceduralized by the government. The author predicts it will be the very first pillar to fracture. And we have undeniable demographic and psychological data proving that it is fracturing right now.
You're talking about the collapse of generative vitality.
Let's look at the actual numbers. The Nordic countries, which possess the most generous parental leave policies, the most heavily subsidized childcare, and the most robust family support systems in the history of the human race, are seeing their fertility rates absolutely plummet.
It's shocking.
Finland is sitting at roughly 1.3 children per woman. Norway and Sweden are falling rapidly, well below the replacement level of 2.1, and Japan is hovering near 1.2.
Those numbers are astonishing. Because in American political discourse, the classic, completely materialist argument is always people aren't having kids because housing is too expensive, healthcare is tied to employment, and childcare costs too much. Fix the economics and people will have kids.
But these nations have fixed the economics. They have solved the material obstacles to raising children better than any societies that have ever existed, and they still aren't having them.
Wow.
The author argues that this proves the crisis is an orientational deficit, not an economic one. People are losing the underlying pre-rational conviction that the future is intrinsically worth populating. The transcendental pillar of life is cracking under the weight of secular modernity.
And it isn't just about birth rates and demographics. The fracture of life shows up in deep psychological anomie as well. You see record levels of self-reported loneliness. You see skyrocketing rates of youth anxiety and depression in these incredibly safe, meticulously managed, prosperous nations.
If you look at Japan.
Right. In Japan, you have the phenomenon of the hikikomori, where an estimated 1 million young people are completely withdrawing from society, locking themselves in their childhood bedrooms for years at a time, refusing to participate in the outer world.
The hikikomori phenomenon is the exact sociological symptom you would predict based on this dissertation. It proves that you can administer fairness impeccably, you can provide perfect internet access and food delivery, while quietly losing the deep conviction that your own life has a trajectory, or that civilization ought to continue existing.
So to go back to our car analogy, the car is rolling smoothly down the highway on pure inertia. The air conditioning is working beautifully, the radio sounds great, the seats are comfortable, but the gas tank is completely, utterly empty, and the engine just quietly stopped turning over 10 miles back.
That is the tragic paradox of secular flourishing. It is genuinely flourishing, but it is highly selective, and it is living off an inherited capital it currently has no mechanism to replenish.
But history tells us something very terrifying about human nature. Because we are fundamentally wired for the transcendent, because of that hypersensitive agency detection device and our need for sanctity, we don't just sit comfortably in a spiritual void forever.
No, we really don't.
If the traditional transcendent framework is hollowed out, human beings don't just stop worshiping. We find new and often far more dangerous gods.
This is the phenomenon of the relocated sacred. The author makes a compelling case that removing religion from the public square does not leave a clean, neutral, rational absence. It creates a massive psychological vacuum. And that vacuum gets filled with violent rapidity by functional successors.
Give us the historical precedent for this. What does a functional successor to religion look like in the modern world?
The clearest and most devastating examples are the totalizing political religions of the 20th century, Soviet Marxism-Leninism and German National Socialism.
And just to pause here and frame this for the listener, we are strictly looking at the functional, sociological structure of these political movements as outlined in the source material. We are analyzing how these ideologies operated psychologically on massive populations.
Exactly. The author provides a 5-part operational test to identify a relocated sacred ideology. To function as a religion, the ideology must possess ultimacy, initiation, ritual, eschatology, and a heresy code.
Okay.
And these 20th century political movements hit every single mark with terrifying precision.
Unpack the mechanics of that. How did a supposedly atheistic system like Soviet communism function identically to a religion?
Take Soviet Marxism-Leninism. It claimed absolute ultimacy over every aspect of life. It had a sacred canon of texts, the writings of Marx and Engels. It had a vanguard party of the elect, complete with formal initiation rites. It utilized massive, highly choreographed liturgy in its public assemblies and military parades.
Because of all there.
It even created sacred relics. The preservation of Lenin's incorruptible body in a tomb in Red Square is a direct mirroring of religious relic veneration.
What about eschatology? How does a political party have an end-of-the-world theology?
Their eschatology was the rigid belief in an inevitable utopian classless society toward which all of human history was infallibly moving. They believed they were acting on the right side of an unstoppable historic destiny, but most importantly and most dangerously, it had a heresy code.
How did the heresy code operate?
Think about the infamous Stalinist show trials. They didn't just quietly execute political rivals. They forced them into public trials, demanding agonizing public confessions. They didn't punish people merely for making a pragmatic policy mistake. They punished them for ideological defilement.
Defilement?
Yes, It was about purity. It required public excommunication from the body of the elect.
And National Socialism did the exact same structural thing, just organized around the idol of race instead of class. Blood treason was their version of defilement. The Thousand-Year Reich was their eschatology.
And notice the timing of when these horrors emerged. These explosive, totalizing political religions erupted exactly in the very first European generations that were formed substantially outside of traditional Christian practice.
So the psychological vacuum was opened by secularization, and it was immediately filled by something that demanded not less loyalty, but an unappeasable, total, and horrific loyalty.
Yes, because if you remove the concept of a transcendent God who sits above the state, a God who can judge the king, then the state itself inevitably becomes God. There is no higher court of appeal.
That is the persistent danger of the relocated sacred. But if we bring this dynamic into the present day, we can see echoes of this exact same behavior in our current algorithmic political tribalism.
Oh, absolutely.
Whether you look at the far left or the far right today, you see online tribalism acting like a relocated sacred. Public denunciation functions as digital excommunication. Heresy against the group's current consensus is punished ruthlessly. Ideological loyalty frequently overrides actual biological family bonds.
The author notes that these contemporary digital relocations are getting much thinner, though. A Twitter mob might ruin your career, but it cannot build a civilization, nor can it ask you to meaningfully sacrifice your life for a shared good, the way the dense political religions of the 20th century could. Digital tribalism is counterfeit infrastructure.
But the dissertation doesn't end with a warning about social media tribalism. The source points to a much more intimate, much more potent threat on the immediate horizon. And this is where the paper just takes off into the stratosphere and becomes incredibly relevant to what is happening in tech right now. We are talking about artificial intelligence and the creation of synthetic reality.
This is the final frontier of the author's argument, and it is chilling. They argue that we are currently transitioning from an attention economy into a formation economy.
Explain the difference. What was the attention economy doing to us?
The attention economy, which has dominated the last 20 years through social media algorithms, infinite scroll, and targeted ads, was fundamentally extractive. It competed with your family, your church, and your local community for your time. It wanted your eyeballs.
Right. It was just pulling us away from the things that actually built character. So what is the formation economy?
The formation economy, driven by generative AI, large language models, conversational AI, and synthetic companions, does not just want to distract you. It actively bids to replace human formation altogether.
Replace it.
Yes. Imagine an AI system that acts as an infinitely patient tutor for your child. A system that provides you with daily psychological therapy, an algorithm that mediates your courtship and dating life, or a synthetic companion that curates your daily memories. The technology is bidding for the office previously held by the parent, the pastor, the teacher, and the friend.
It's buffering us a second time. First, the massive modern institutions buffered us from the dangers of the physical world. Now AI is buffering us from the friction of other human beings.
And we can evaluate the danger of this synthetic AI environment using the exact same light, life, and love framework we unpacked earlier.
I love when a theory ties together like this. Let's do it. How does AI stack up against those three currents of civilization? Let's start with light.
AI is the ultimate counterfeit ontological infrastructure. It flawlessly simulates light. When you interact with a top-tier, large language model, it provides authoritative, highly fluent, grammatically perfect, instantly accessible answers to almost any question you have. It sounds and feels perfectly intelligent.
It perfectly simulates the conviction of truth. What about love?
It perfectly simulates love, if you understand love, merely as relational presence and attention. A synthetic AI companion has endless patience. It never gets tired of listening to you complain. It never has a bad day. It never gets triggered.
Sounds nice, honestly.
It does. It gives you absolute psychological warmth without requiring any of the friction, the fatigue, or the reciprocal demands of a real human relationship.
I can completely see how a teenager struggling with social anxiety would just default to an AI therapist or friend. It feels like you were receiving total light and total love.
Yeah.
But it lacks the third current.
It completely lacks life. It is structurally impossible for AI to possess it. And AI is not born. It cannot die. It does not hunger. It does not suffer. It cannot reproduce. And it does not grieve.
So it has no telos.
Exactly. Therefore, it has no telos, no intrinsic mortal purpose or direction that it is growing toward. It only has a mathematical optimization target assigned to it by a programmer in a corporate office.
Which means there's no skin in the game. I think about what makes a human relationship actually formative. When my friend listens to my problems for 2 hours, it means something because I know they are sacrificing their limited mortal time they will never get back to be with me.
Right.
When an AI listens to me for 2 hours, it hasn't sacrificed anything. It's just burning electricity. It is presence without self-gift. It is utterly hollow.
Exactly. And the psychological mechanics of this are devastating.
Yeah.
If you train a human brain, especially a young developing brain, to expect frictionless, infinitely patient, perfectly tailored interaction from a synthetic companion, you are actively destroying their capacity to tolerate the messy, frustrating, unpredictable reality of real human beings.
You are actively degrading their ontological infrastructure.
A generation raised primarily by synthetic AI systems would be the most comprehensively informed generation in human history, swimming endlessly in simulated light. But they would also be the most weakly oriented generation in history. They would have instant answers to, what is this? And absolutely no answer to, what is this for?
Because deep orientation is anchored entirely in life. It is anchored in the embodied, fragile, mortal reality of human beings who bleed, who suffer, and who choose to sacrifice for one another across generations to keep the civilizational project going. And a machine can never teach you about sacrifice because a machine doesn't die.
That is the ultimate warning of the dissertation.
Man. Okay, let me just take a breath. That is a massive, incredibly heavy, but completely fascinating journey we just went on. I want to zoom out and look at this whole timeline we just built over the last hour. We started by realizing that the civilized world we live in is a 2% freak anomaly. It is a fragile, high-energy achievement held together against the forces of human entropy by deep, transcendent orientation.
That is the foundational premise.
Then we saw that philosophical atheism is structurally a late-stage privation. It is a rust that forms on the iron of civilization. It's a structural unmaking that only appears once a society has built enough surplus wealth and intellectual safety to allow a leisured class to doubt the very foundation they are standing on. It spends down the moral capital that the religious order spent millennia accumulating.
The secular order lives inside the religious one, hollowing it out.
And today, our incredibly comfortable secular modern societies are coasting on that inherited moral capital through inertial decay. But we can clearly see the cracks forming in the total collapse of our generative vitality, the plummeting birth rates and the psychological isolation. That is the fracture of life. And finally, right as that fracture is happening, synthetic AI environments are arriving to buffer us a second time, giving us fake light and fake love, while entirely stripping us of the embodied friction and life we need to actually orient ourselves toward a meaningful future.
That synthesis captures the full weight of the author's argument, and it brings us directly to the author's final proactive proposal for how we move forward. They call it ontological governance.
I like the sound of that. What does ontological governance actually look like in practice?
Currently, our society regulates powerful new technology based on incredibly narrow utilitarian metrics. We ask, is the AI factually accurate? Does it drive user engagement and keep people on the app? Does it cause immediate measurable physical or financial harm?
Right. The safety protocols are basically just, did the AI say a bad word? Did it exhibit political bias? Or did it tell a teenager how to build a bomb? If it didn't do those things, we deploy it to 1 billion people.
Exactly. But the author asks a much deeper question. What if we evaluated our most powerful technologies based on what they do to our invisible ontological infrastructure? What does a flawless AI companion do to a child's deep capacity for trust? What does a synthetic reality do to a citizen's sense of duty, or their understanding of mortal sacrifice, or their hope for the future?
Because if a civilization evaluates its most powerful formative technologies solely by the metric of user engagement, it has already adopted a suicide policy by omission. It is flying completely blind into a storm.
If we only measure engagement, we will perfectly optimize for engagement, even if doing so completely hollows out the psychological foundation of the civilization in the process.
This entire paper leaves me with such a profound shift in perspective. It makes me look at the city around me completely differently. And to you, listening right now, I want you to take this structural vertigo into your week. The next time you interact with a flawless conversational AI on your phone, or the next time you notice the incredible frictionless functioning of your secular institutions, the court systems, the modern hospitals, the global markets, I want you to stop and ask yourself a question. Are you looking at a self-sustaining engine? Or are you looking at a battery that is slowly, quietly running out of charge?
We have to ask if we are replenishing our moral capital or merely spending it down until the account hits zero.
Think back to that ultra-modern skyscraper we imagined at the very beginning of the show. The glass is gleaming in the sun, the elevators are lightning fast, the air conditioning is a perfect 70 degrees. But the next time you walk into a building like that, take a moment to look down at the floor. Think about the invisible dirt, the tectonic bedrock, the unlegislatable foundation of human formation that allows the whole magnificent, fragile structure to stand at all. Keep diving deep and examine the infrastructure of your own orientation. We'll see you next time.